The auction block stood silent now. The crowd dispersed, leaving only the echoes of what had transpired. Michelle Hill clutched the papers in her trembling hands, the deed of purchase that had changed everything. Across the dusty square, Kenneth Parker knelt beside a small boy, his weathered face streaked with tears he had held back for months. The child's arms wrapped around his father's neck, and Kenneth's voice, rough from years of mountain solitude, broke as he whispered, "I thought I'd lost you forever, son. I thought they'd taken you from me for good." The words carried across the evening air, reaching Michelle where she stood, her own eyes brimming with tears as she witnessed the reunion she had made possible. The townspeople who remained fell silent, many wiping their eyes, finally understanding the true cost of their judgment and the profound grace of one woman's compassion. But this moment of redemption had roots that stretched back through months of hardship, misunderstanding, and a chain of events that had brought them all to this crossroads. The story began in the harsh mountain country where Kenneth Parker had carved out a life for himself and his young son. Far from the judgment of civilization, in a place where a man's worth was measured not by his appearance or social standing, but by his ability to survive and protect what mattered most. Kenneth Parker had never been a man who sought the company of others. The mountains suited him, with their honest brutality and unforgiving beauty. Here, among the towering pines and rocky outcroppings, he had built a cabin with his own hands, raised his boy Carl after his wife's death in childbirth, and lived by the simple code that hard work and integrity were worth more than fine clothes or smooth words. His face bore the marks of this harsh life, weathered by sun and wind, scarred from encounters with wild animals and the unforgiving landscape. His clothes were patched and worn, his hands calloused and rough, but his heart was steady and his love for his son unwavering. The boy Carl had grown up wild and free in these mountains, learning to track deer, to read the weather in the clouds, to find his way by the stars. At 8 years old, he possessed a wisdom about the natural world that city children could never understand, but he had never known the company of other children or the comforts that money could buy. Kenneth worried sometimes about this isolation, wondered if he was doing right by the boy. But every time he considered venturing into town, he remembered the looks, the whispers, the way people judged him by his appearance rather than his character. The trouble began with the drought. The summer had been merciless, the streams running low, the forest tinder dry. Kenneth had watched the sky day after day, hoping for clouds that never came, rationing their water, making the difficult decision to venture into the valley town for supplies they desperately needed. He had avoided this journey for over a year, but necessity left him no choice. With Carl beside him on the wagon, he had made the long trek down the mountain pass, both of them knowing they would face the stares and judgment of the townspeople. The town of Cedar Falls had never been kind to outsiders, and Kenneth Parker, with his wild appearance and mountain ways, represented everything they feared and misunderstood about the wilderness that surrounded their ordered lives. When he walked down Main Street, children pointed and mothers pulled them closer. Shopkeepers watched him with suspicious eyes, and men gathered in small groups, whispering about the mountain man who lived like a savage with his boy. It was during this visit that disaster struck. Carl had wandered away while Kenneth conducted business at the general store, drawn by the sound of other children playing in the town square. Kenneth had found him there, laughing and running with a group of local children who seemed delighted by this wild boy from the mountains. For a moment, Kenneth's heart had lifted, seeing his son experience the joy of companionship he had been denied. But that joy turned to horror when one of the children, the banker's daughter, fell from the wooden platform where they had been playing. The accident was swift and terrible. The girl struck her head on the stone steps, blood pooling beneath her golden curls. Carl, who had been nearest to her when she fell, knelt beside her, his small hands reaching out to help. But the adults who came running saw only what they expected to see. A wild mountain boy, covered in dirt and dressed in rough clothes, standing over their precious, well-dressed daughter. In their panic and grief, they needed someone to blame, and Kenneth Parker's son was the perfect target. The accusations came fast and furious. Carl had pushed her, they claimed. The mountain boy was violent, dangerous, just like his savage father. Kenneth's protests fell on deaf ears. His attempts to explain what had really happened dismissed as the lies of a man protecting his guilty child. The town sheriff, Ronald White, was a weak man who bent easily to the pressure of the prominent citizens. Within hours, Carl had been taken from his father's arms, declared a ward of the state pending investigation of the incident. Kenneth's world crumbled in that moment. He fought with every legal means at his disposal, but he was a poor mountain man facing the combined wealth and influence of the town's elite. His rough appearance and lack of formal education worked against him in every courtroom, every meeting with officials. Lawyers looked at him with barely concealed disdain. Judges saw only what they expected to see, a wild man unfit to raise a civilized child. The investigation into the accident was perfunctory at best, the conclusion foregone from the moment the townspeople had made their judgment. For months, Kenneth had fought the system that had stolen his son. He sold everything he owned to pay legal fees, mortgaged his land, spent his days in the town that despised him, sleeping in his wagon outside the courthouse, waiting for any chance to see Carl, to fight for his return. But the boy had been placed in the care of the state, housed in the county orphanage, and Kenneth was allowed only brief, supervised visits that broke his heart each time. Carl had changed during those months of separation. The wild, free spirit of the mountains had been slowly crushed under the weight of institutional life. His eyes, once bright with curiosity and joy, had grown dim and fearful. The other children at the orphanage, influenced by the adults around them, treated him as an outcast, the dangerous mountain boy who had hurt the banker's daughter. He spoke little during Kenneth's visits, clinging to his father with desperate intensity, begging to come home in whispers that tore Kenneth's soul apart. The final blow came when Kenneth's legal appeals were exhausted, his money gone, his land foreclosed upon to pay his debts. The state had made its decision. Carl would be placed for adoption, preferably with a respectable family who could provide him with proper civilization and education. Kenneth Parker, deemed unfit by reason of his poverty, his appearance, and his unconventional lifestyle, would have no further claim to his son. The boy would be put up for auction, as was the custom for orphan children in those days, sold to the highest bidder among approved families. Kenneth had spent his last dollars on a decent suit for the auction, hoping against hope that somehow he could scrape together enough money to buy back his own son. But as he stood in the town square that day, surrounded by well-dressed families with their clean children and respectable appearances, he knew he was beaten. His few remaining coins would not compete with the wealth of the banker, the doctor, the merchant families who saw Carl as a charity case to be reformed rather than a child to be loved. It was then that Michelle Hill had arrived, her condition obvious despite her attempts to conceal it beneath a loose-fitting dress. She was new to Cedar Falls, having come to town only weeks earlier, and the whispers followed her as surely as they had followed Kenneth. An unmarried woman, pregnant and alone, seeking work and shelter in a town that had little tolerance for those who fell outside its narrow definition of respectability. Michelle had her own story of hardship and loss. She had been engaged to a young man who had died in a mining accident before they could be wed, leaving her alone and carrying his child. Her family had disowned her, unable to bear the shame of her condition, and she had wandered from town to town, seeking a place where she might make a life for herself and her unborn baby. Cedar Falls had seemed as good as any other place, and she had found work as a seamstress, renting a small room above the dress shop, keeping to herself and trying to ignore the stares and whispers that followed her everywhere. On the morning of the auction, Michelle had been walking past the town square when she saw the crowd gathering. Curiosity had drawn her closer, and horror had kept her rooted to the spot as she realized what was happening. Children, orphaned and abandoned, were being sold like livestock to the highest bidder. The auctioneer's voice rang out over the crowd, describing each child's qualities and defects as if they were horses or cattle being evaluated for purchase. She had watched family after family step forward to claim their chosen children, saw the relief on some young faces and the terror on others. And then she had seen Carl, the mountain boy she had heard whispered about in the shops and streets. He stood on the auction block, small and frightened, his eyes searching the crowd until they found his father. The love and desperation in that gaze had struck Michelle like a physical blow, reminding her of her own losses, her own loneliness, her own desperate hope for family and belonging. The bidding for Carl had been half-hearted at best. His reputation as a dangerous child had preceded him, and most families wanted nothing to do with the boy who had supposedly injured the banker's daughter. Only a few offers came forward, and those were clearly motivated by the desire for cheap labor rather than genuine care. Kenneth had bid his few remaining coins, his voice breaking as he was quickly outbid by others with deeper pockets and better standing in the community. Michelle had watched Kenneth's face as he realized he could not compete, saw the moment when hope died in his eyes and was replaced by the terrible acceptance of defeat. She had seen him mouth the words, "I love you," to his son, had watched Carl's small face crumple with understanding that his father could not save him. And in that moment, something had broken open in Michelle's heart, a recognition of shared suffering that transcended the boundaries of judgment and social convention. Without fully understanding what she was doing or why, Michelle had stepped forward and raised her hand. Her voice, clear and strong despite her trembling, had called out a bid that silenced the crowd. She had offered everything she had, every cent she had saved from her seamstress work, every coin she had hoarded for her own child's future. The amount was substantial enough to shock the gathered townspeople, far more than anyone had expected to pay for the unwanted mountain boy. The auctioneer had looked uncertain, glancing toward the town's leading citizens for guidance. A pregnant, unmarried woman was hardly the ideal candidate to adopt a child, especially one with Carl's reputation. But Michelle's money was as good as anyone else's, and the law was clear. The highest bidder would take the child, regardless of the moral objections of the community. As the gavel fell and Carl was declared sold to Michelle Hill, the crowd had erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. Kenneth had stared at her in bewilderment, unable to understand why this stranger would spend her life savings to buy his son. Michelle herself had been shaking with the magnitude of what she had done, the impulsive decision that had changed 3 lives forever in the span of a few minutes. The paperwork had been completed in tense silence, the town officials clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but bound by law to honor the sale. Michelle had signed the documents with trembling hands, officially becoming Carl's legal guardian, while Kenneth stood nearby, his face a mask of confusion and desperate hope. The crowd had begun to disperse, shaking their heads and muttering about the scandal of it all. An unmarried pregnant woman buying a dangerous child from his own father. But Michelle had not led Carl away as everyone expected. Instead, she had walked directly to Kenneth, the papers clutched in her hands, and had spoken words that would echo through the town for years to come. Her voice had been quiet but clear, carrying to every ear in the square as she said, "This boy belongs with his father. I bought him not to keep him, but to give him back where he belongs. No amount of money should be able to separate a loving parent from their child." The silence that followed had been profound. Kenneth had stared at her in disbelief, unable to comprehend such unexpected kindness from a stranger. Carl had looked between them, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that this nightmare might finally be ending. And the townspeople who remained had stood frozen, confronted suddenly with the magnitude of their own cruelty and the grace of this woman they had scorned. Michelle had pressed the papers into Kenneth's hands, legally transferring custody back to him, making him once again the rightful guardian of his son. The gesture had cost her everything she owned, left her penniless and vulnerable in a town that already judged her harshly, but she had done it without hesitation, driven by an understanding of love and loss that transcended social boundaries. Kenneth had fallen to his knees then, overwhelmed by gratitude and disbelief. His arms had wrapped around his son, holding him close for the first time in months. And the tears he had held back through all the legal battles and heartbreak had finally come. Carl had clung to him, sobbing with relief, and the sound of their reunion had carried across the square, touching hearts that had been hardened by prejudice and fear. The immediate aftermath of Michelle's gesture had been chaotic. The town officials had scrambled to understand the legal implications of her actions, while the gathered citizens had struggled to process what they had witnessed. Some had been moved to tears by the reunion of father and son, finally seeing past Kenneth's rough appearance to recognize the depth of his love for Carl. Others had been angry, feeling that their judgment had been questioned and their authority undermined by the actions of an outsider. But Michelle had not lingered to face their reactions. Exhausted by the emotional toll of what she had done and the financial reality of her situation, she had quietly slipped away from the square, returning to her small room above the dress shop to contemplate the consequences of her impulsive act of kindness. She had given away her security, her savings, her hope for a stable future for her unborn child, all for strangers she barely knew. The practical part of her mind questioned the wisdom of what she had done, but her heart knew it had been right. Kenneth had found her there that evening, still clutching the custody papers, still unable to fully believe that his son had been returned to him. He had knocked softly on her door, Carl beside him, both of them cleaned up and dressed in the best clothes they owned. When Michelle had opened the door, Kenneth had struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude, his voice breaking as he tried to thank her for the gift she had given them. "You saved my boy," he had said simply, his rough hands trembling as he spoke. "You gave him back to me when the whole world said I wasn't worthy to be his father. I don't understand why you did it, ma'am, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of such kindness." Michelle had looked at this man who had been judged so harshly by the town, seeing past his weathered appearance to the gentle soul beneath. She had seen the way Carl looked at his father, the absolute trust and love in the boy's eyes, and had known that her sacrifice had been worthwhile. "Every child deserves to be with someone who loves them," she had replied quietly, "and it was clear that you love your son more than life itself." The conversation that followed had been tentative at first, two strangers bound together by an extraordinary act of compassion, trying to understand each other across the vast differences in their backgrounds and circumstances. Kenneth had spoken of his life in the mountains, his struggles as a single father, his love for his son that had driven him to fight against impossible odds. Michelle had shared her own story of loss and displacement, her fears about facing motherhood alone in a hostile world. As they talked, a bond had begun to form between them, built on shared understanding of what it meant to be judged unfairly, to face the world's cruelty alone, to fight for those they loved against overwhelming opposition. Kenneth had learned that Michelle's act of kindness had left her destitute, with no money for food or shelter, facing the prospect of giving birth alone and penniless. The realization had stirred something protective in his nature, a recognition that this woman who had saved his family now needed saving herself. "You can't stay here," Kenneth had said, looking around the tiny, shabby room that was all Michelle could afford. "This town has already judged you, and it'll only get worse when your baby comes. You need somewhere safe, somewhere you can raise your child without shame or fear." Michelle had protested that she had no other options, nowhere else to go, but Kenneth had been insistent. "Come with us," he had said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Come to the mountains. I've got land up there, good land with clean water and fresh air. I can build you a cabin of your own, help you get settled before the baby comes. It's not much of a life by town standards, but it's honest and free, and no one will judge you for your past." The offer had been overwhelming in its generosity, this man who owed her everything now offering to share his world with her. Michelle had hesitated, knowing that accepting would mean leaving behind any hope of conventional respectability, any chance of finding acceptance in civilized society. But as she looked at Kenneth and Carl, saw the genuine warmth in their eyes, she had realized that respectability was less important than kindness, that acceptance from these two souls was worth more than the approval of an entire town. The decision to leave Cedar Falls had not been made lightly, but once made, it had brought a sense of relief to all three of them. Kenneth had used the last of his resources to purchase a wagon and supplies for the journey, while Michelle had gathered her few possessions and prepared to leave behind the life she had tried to build in town. The townspeople had watched their preparations with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, many convinced that the pregnant woman was making a terrible mistake in trusting her future to the wild mountain man. But there had been others, quieter voices, who had begun to question their own judgment in the wake of Michelle's sacrifice. The banker's daughter, recovered now from her accident, had finally found the courage to tell the truth about what had happened that day in the square. Carl had not pushed her, she admitted tearfully to her parents. She had slipped and fallen while showing off, and the mountain boy had only been trying to help her. The revelation had sent shockwaves through the community, forcing them to confront the terrible injustice they had perpetrated against an innocent child and his loving father. The journey to Kenneth's mountain home had taken 3 days, winding through forest paths and rocky trails that tested both the wagon and their resolve. Michelle, heavy with child and unused to such rough travel, had struggled at times, but Kenneth had been endlessly patient and considerate, stopping frequently to rest, ensuring her comfort as much as possible given the circumstances. Carl had proven to be an excellent guiding companion, his knowledge of the mountain paths invaluable, his spirits lifted by the return to the wilderness he loved. As they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the valley town far behind, Michelle had felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The air grew cleaner and thinner, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the whisper of wind through pine trees and the call of wild birds. For the first time in months, she had felt truly free, unobserved and unjudged, able to simply exist without the constant pressure of social expectations. Kenneth's cabin, when they finally reached it, had been more substantial than Michelle had expected. Built from logs he had cut and shaped himself, it stood in a clearing beside a clear mountain stream, surrounded by towering pines and granite outcroppings. The structure was simple but solid, with a wide porch and large windows that let in the mountain light. It was clear that Kenneth was a skilled craftsman, that he had built not just a shelter, but a true home for himself and his son. True to his word, Kenneth had immediately begun work on a second cabin for Michelle, choosing a site near the stream, but far enough away to provide privacy and independence. He had worked tirelessly, cutting trees, shaping logs, laying the foundation with his own hands while Carl helped with smaller tasks, and Michelle contributed what she could despite her condition. The work had been therapeutic for all of them, a physical manifestation of their commitment to building a new life together in this mountain sanctuary. As autumn turned to winter, Michelle's cabin had taken shape, a smaller version of Kenneth's home, but equally well-built and comfortable. Kenneth had insisted on installing a large stone fireplace, knowing that the mountain winters were harsh and that Michelle would need warmth and comfort when her baby came. He had crafted furniture with his own hands, simple but sturdy pieces that would serve her well, and had stocked the cabin with supplies and provisions for the months ahead. The birth of Michelle's daughter had come in the depths of winter, during a blizzard that had cut them off from the outside world for days. Kenneth had served as midwife, his gentle hands and calm presence helping Michelle through the long hours of labor. Carl had waited anxiously in the main cabin, tending the fires and preparing warm blankets, his young face serious with the responsibility he felt for this new addition to their mountain family. When Jessica was finally born, healthy and strong despite the harsh circumstances, she had been welcomed into a family bound not by blood, but by choice and sacrifice. Kenneth had held her with the tenderness of an experienced father, while Carl had marveled at her tiny fingers and toes, immediately assuming the role of protective big brother. Michelle, exhausted but radiant, had looked around at these people who had become her family and had known that she was truly home. The months that followed had been the happiest of Michelle's life. She had watched Jessica grow strong and healthy in the clean mountain air, had seen Carl blossom as he regained his confidence and joy, had observed Kenneth as he revealed more and more of his gentle, caring nature. The harsh judgments of the town seemed like a distant nightmare, replaced by the simple rhythms of mountain life and the deep satisfaction of genuine human connection. Kenneth had proven to be everything Michelle had hoped for in a partner and friend. He was patient with her inexperience in mountain living, teaching her to read the weather, to preserve food for winter, to find her way through the forest paths. He had never presumed upon their arrangement, never suggested that her gratitude should extend beyond friendship, but had simply been present and supportive as she found her footing in this new life. As spring returned to the mountains, bringing wildflowers and rushing streams swollen with snowmelt, Michelle had realized that she had fallen in love not just with the mountain life, but with the man who had made it possible. Kenneth's quiet strength, his unwavering devotion to his son, his gentle consideration for her needs and feelings, had won her heart gradually but completely. She had begun to hope that he might feel the same way, had caught him looking at her sometimes with an expression that suggested deeper feelings than mere friendship. The confirmation of their mutual love had come naturally, without dramatic declarations or grand gestures. It had been in the way Kenneth's hand lingered when he helped her with a difficult task, in the way Michelle's eyes sought his across the clearing when Jessica took her first steps, in the quiet conversations by the fire when the children were asleep and they could speak freely of their hopes and dreams. Their wedding had been a simple affair, performed by a traveling preacher who made his rounds through the mountain communities. Carl had served as best man, his face glowing with happiness at seeing his father find love again, while Jessica had slept peacefully in Michelle's arms throughout the ceremony. There had been no guests beyond their small family, no elaborate celebrations or expensive gifts, but the joy and love that filled their mountain clearing had been more precious than any grand society wedding. The years that followed had brought their share of challenges and hardships, as mountain life always did. There had been harsh winters that tested their preparations and resolve, summers of drought that threatened their water supply, encounters with wild animals that reminded them of the dangers of their chosen isolation. But they had faced each challenge together, their bond growing stronger with each trial overcome. Carl had grown into a fine young man under Kenneth's guidance and Michelle's nurturing care, learning not just the practical skills needed for mountain survival, but also the values of compassion, integrity, and sacrifice that his parents embodied. Jessica had thrived in the mountain environment, growing strong and independent, equally at home tracking deer with her stepfather and brother, or helping her mother with the domestic tasks that kept their household running. The town of Cedar Falls had not forgotten them, though years had passed since their dramatic departure. Occasionally, travelers would bring news of the Mountain family, stories that grew in the telling until Kenneth and Michelle had become almost legendary figures, symbols of love triumphant over social prejudice and material hardship. Some of these stories painted them as noble outcasts, others as dangerous recluses, but all acknowledged the extraordinary nature of their union and the sacrifice that had made it possible. When Carl turned 18, he had made the decision to return to Cedar Falls, not to stay, but to confront the place that had treated his family so cruelly. He had walked down Main Street with his head held high, no longer the frightened boy who had been torn from his father's arms, but a confident young man who had been raised with love and dignity. The townspeople who remembered the old scandal had stared in amazement at this transformation, seeing in Carl's bearing and character the proof of Kenneth's worthiness as a father. The banker's daughter, now a young woman herself, had sought Carl out during his visit, wanting to apologize personally for the lie that had caused so much suffering. Her confession, made publicly in the town square where the auction had taken place years earlier, had finally cleared Carl's name and vindicated Kenneth's faith in his son's innocence. The moment had been emotional for both of them, a healing of old wounds and a recognition of how much pain could have been avoided if truth and compassion had prevailed over prejudice and fear. Carl had returned to the mountains with news of this vindication, but also with a deeper understanding of the world beyond their sanctuary. He had seen how the town had changed, how some of the people who had judged his family so harshly had grown in wisdom and regret. He had also seen how their story had inspired others, how Michelle's act of sacrifice had become a legend that encouraged compassion and challenged people to look beyond surface appearances to the heart beneath. As Kenneth and Michelle grew older, their mountain home became a beacon for others who sought refuge from a world that judged too quickly and forgave too slowly. They welcomed travelers and outcasts, shared their knowledge and resources with those in need, and raised their children to value character over appearance, love over wealth, and truth over convenience. Their legacy was not measured in material success, but in the lives they had touched and the example they had set. The story of the pregnant woman who bought the mountain man his boy at auction had become more than just a tale of individual kindness. It had become a parable about the power of love to overcome injustice, about the courage required to stand against social pressure, and about the unexpected ways that sacrifice and compassion could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Visitors to Cedar Falls would often ask to hear the story, and in the telling, the town's shame was balanced by recognition of the grace that had emerged from their collective failure. Michelle often reflected on that day in the town square, marveling at the chain of events that had brought her family together. She had acted on impulse, driven by empathy and a recognition of shared suffering, never imagining that her spontaneous gesture would lead to such profound happiness and fulfillment. The money she had spent to buy Carl's freedom had been returned to her a thousandfold in love, family, and the deep satisfaction of a life lived according to her deepest values. Kenneth, too, had found in their union a completion he had never expected. The loss of his first wife had left him believing that he was destined to raise Carl alone, to face the world's judgment and hostility without a partner to share the burden. Michelle's love had not only restored his son to him, but had given him a companion who understood his heart and shared his values, someone who saw past his rough exterior to the gentle soul within. As the sun set over their mountain home, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Michelle and Kenneth sat on their porch watching their children play in the clearing below. Carl, now a man with a family of his own, had built his cabin nearby, choosing to remain in the mountains that had shaped him. Jessica, grown into a confident young woman, moved between her parents and brother with the easy grace of someone who had never known shame or rejection. The town that had once judged them so harshly seemed like a distant memory, its power to wound them long since broken by the strength of their love and the passage of time. They had built something precious in these mountains, a family and a life that proved love could triumph over prejudice, that sacrifice could yield unexpected rewards, and that sometimes the most important victories were won not through force or wealth, but through simple human kindness and the courage to act according to one's deepest convictions. In the gathering twilight, as the first stars appeared above the mountain peaks, Michelle reached for Kenneth's hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of decades spent together. They had traveled far from that day in the town square, when a desperate act of compassion had changed 3 lives forever. But the love that had begun in that moment of sacrifice continued to grow and flourish, a testament to the enduring power of human goodness in a world that often seemed to have forgotten its value.